Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for this conversation on the future of fertility. I feel like we've already started the panel conversation, just us all talking before we came up here. Obviously, there is so much that we're going to dive into on this topic, and we appreciate you being here. I will leave some time for audience questions, so if you have those, start thinking about them, and we'll have some mics come out in the audience a little bit later. But let me introduce my panel today. We have Dr. Amander Clark right here. She's the director of the UCLA Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education. We have Dr. Natalie Crawford, an OBGYN, co-founder of Fora Fertility, and also the host of the podcast As a Woman. And we also have Tammy Sun, founder and CEO of Carrot Fertility. Thank you all for joining me today. It's great to have you on this panel. Let's start broadly, and then we're going to dive in on some specific treatments, and then, of course, what we're sort of seeing happen right now when it comes to threats to reproductive care or different policies that we're seeing roll out across the country, attitudes shifting. But let's start with just the most monumental, both in a positive and negative way, shifts in treatment as well as attitudes when it comes to fertility care. I'll start with you, Dr. Clark.
Right. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. So I run a Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education at UCLA, and I'm going to start at that end of the spectrum, that healthcare depends upon high-quality science and research, and policy around healthcare also depends on high-quality research and science. And so what I had noticed as part of my experience as a stem cell scientist, reproductive biologist, is that there are fewer and fewer students who are entering into sciences and entering into careers in reproductive science and health. So there are a lot of students interested in being OBGYNs, but in terms of the science that underpins this technology, there's fewer and fewer opportunities. And so in terms of education, I feel like this has been under threat for decades. But what we're seeing right now is the tip of the spear in terms of reproductive health and care being under threat, given the new policies that are being created today in the United States.
I'm a fertility doctor, so from a standpoint, there's two major shifts that I've seen. Certainly in the 10 years that I've been in the field, we are seeing more people share and talk about their fertility journey out in the open, which is so impactful because it helps destigmatize what you're going through. It helps lessen the isolation, but we also see an empowerment where you don't just have to show up and do what your doctor says. You're able to be more educated, ask questions, take more autonomy in your own journey. From a scientific standpoint, the technology with IVF has changed immensely. In the past decade, egg freezing has now become not experimental and very mainstream, and genetic testing of embryos has improved our success rates. So we have a technology that's gotten better. We're able to help more people, and we're having more people aware that this technology exists. So we're at this crucial moment where one of the biggest issues is actually access to care, and I'll let Tammy answer that one.
Thank you. I actually totally agree that there has been a massive cultural shift in the areas of both reproductive and post-reproductive care. I mean, we're talking about openly today about menopause care, perimenopause, and post-reproductive care for women. So I lead Carrot. We are the leading platform for lifelong fertility healthcare globally. We serve over 1,000 customers who are employers, leading health plans and health systems. And the biggest shift that I've seen is really just the velocity and appetite for employers and payers to fill this gap, which has really existed in the healthcare system since IVF was invented 40, 50 years ago at this point, to make sure that women are supported in pregnancy, in menopause, in IVF, in egg freezing. And so we've seen a really strong acceleration of workplace culture and workplace policies that are continuing to move very fast in the direction of making sure that men and women and people of every age and sex and gender have robust and comprehensive access to fertility care.
Are we seeing these higher rates of infertility because we're talking about it more, because people are investigating it more, or because something is changing with our health?
So in terms of the underlying biology of infertility, that's not changing. But what is changing is the environment that we live in. And so we know that infertility is associated with obesity. Infertility is associated with exposure to endocrine disruptors, with exposure to pesticides. So the life that we're living right now, the life that we've built for ourselves in this world, is having an impact on our fertility. But I don't want anyone to think that infertility is increasing because of some fundamental change in our reproductive reproductive systems, that's actually not the case at all. It's how we're living in society that is really impacting our ability to have a child, number one. And number two, the age of first birth in the United States is increasing. And so access to reproductive technologies is getting higher because women are having their first child that in their 30s and 40s. And we know that there is some biology there in the female body because a woman only makes a certain number of eggs, and those eggs will run out and they will become lower in quality after the age of 35. And so there's this really interesting societal shift of when individuals and couples are starting their families, and as a result of that, combined with the environment we live in, this is leading to an increase in access for reproductive technology.
Yeah, I actually think it's both. We definitely see as people are more aware that certain things are not normal, they're seeking care, they know that there's treatment for infertility. Might you not get diagnosed if there's nothing you can do about it? But at the same point, as what Dr. Clark says, we see an increase in the world we live in causing higher rates of PCOS, endometriosis, autoimmune disease, things that severely impact our reproduction. We're seeing a decrease in sperm counts across the board. We're seeing people wait longer to start their family. So even though we have access to reproductive care, which can help, even a study looking at female physicians overestimated the success of IVF by more than 10 times. So there's this idea that, well, I can just wait and I can do IVF later. But if anybody's done IVF, it's not that easy.
No.
Not every egg is going to make it into a baby. And actually the attrition is so poor. But really we see that the rates of infertility are increasing because one, we're better aware of it. We're trying to capture it. As a society, fertility is a marker now of your overall health. So we know that if you have infertility, you're higher risk for other health problems later on, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, cancer even. And a lot of that is connected to the way that we live and the lifestyle that just in general is accepted.
Yeah, and I think, the work that we do also, meets not just the rising rates of infertility, but just the general rising demand for IVF from people who may not have infertility, but have a need or a desire. So for example, same-sex couples, gay couples who, want to pursue parenthood and build their families through adoption, which is certainly an option, but surrogacy and IVF is an important part of their needs around healthcare as well. And so we know, 65, and it's probably higher today, the last studies tell us that 65% of LGBTQ people want to or intend to pursue parenthood in some way through IVF or another form of fertility-related healthcare. So I think there's multiple tailwinds in addition to the, general increasing acknowledgement of infertility rates.
Dr. Crawford, I feel like we can't have this, or I hope anyway, that we start to have this conversation about infertility, including male infertility. I just did a bunch of reporting for NBC News for the Today Show. Women who are undergoing all these treatments that they do not necessarily need because their partner has not come in and been tested. And it honestly blew my mind. And hearing, I was able to speak with a bunch of couples who I was fortunate enough opened up to me about that experience, and the men saying, I never thought it could have been me. But also doctors not necessarily saying on day one, if you're having problems, they should be here too. We should be testing that too. Obviously the test's quite a bit easier than it is for females.
So much easier.
So what is going on in that regard?
There's definitely still a stigma and a paternalism in medicine in general. There's also the burden of childhood, parenthood has always been placed on women, right? That's your role in society and even within a relationship. Like that's the traditional standard. And even within couples, you would be shocked how many people will come to me and say, well, my partner's not going to get a semen analysis, but I know the problem's me. Or he had a kid 10 years ago, so he's not going to do that. I'm lucky because we started our own clinic 4 years ago, and he has to come in. He has to get a semen analysis. We're not going any further. You're not getting invasive diagnostics. We're not walking this road because it's not fair to then go do treatment and find out he has no sperm or such low sperm counts that it's never going to happen. Sperm are very fragile. They change. Your sperm counts can change every 3 months. We know that, one bad illness, getting COVID, having the flu can completely plummet your sperm counts. We see such a rise in males using testosterone and even getting it from healthcare providers, going in for fatigue and low libido, even though they might want to be pregnant, are put on testosterone from healthcare providers, causing their sperm counts to be 0. And sometimes that's not reversible. So it's really important that we include in the discussion. I will say that the modern approach to fertility, and this is one of those small tangents where COVID has really helped us, is the access of telemedicine. So I still see all of my first new patient consults on telemedicine. It's a 60-minute visit, and that allows both partners to join from wherever they are. And it has increased the fact that both people can hear the information, because traditionally, before that, there so often would be the woman in my office. I would tell her, we'd go through it, and she has to go home and transmit all this information. This burden is on her to then break the bad news or talk about how expensive it is or all the tests they have to go through. And so if both parties can be present, because a lot of that visit is educating. I'm trying to get my patients really back up to that reproductive biology baseline that they should have learned, that we should be taught about our bodies in high school, that nobody knows. And once you bring people to that level, then every guy will say, oh yeah, I need to get a semen analysis. So it's just really this society idea that it can't be him, or that because he got somebody pregnant at one time, I had sperm then, so I must now. And that's just not how the male body works.
Let's talk about egg freezing, probably one of the most commonly understood, talked about treatments. Lots of women do this as an insurance policy.
I hate it. So I'm sorry. I'll just say this and then you can ask me a question.
Yeah.
I hate the word insurance policy for egg freezing because it gives the idea that when you need them, they're going to cash in. You get in a car accident, then your car is going to get fixed with your car insurance. That is not the case with egg freezing, but it's an investment. And just like investing your money in the stock market, it's going to depend on the environment of which you pull the money out. So many factors we don't know yet. Who your partner might be, how your health will be, a variety of different things really impact that success rate. Number one, being your own health and the age you are when you freeze your eggs and how many you have. But what we see is that people feel like it's an insurance policy. Then they'll delay trying even later. And then when their insurance policy fails them, they're so frustrated. But if we view it like investing our money, that's not a guarantee. We all know that. But is it smart to invest your money? It is. Most people know that it's smart to invest your money. So viewing it through the right lens, counseling that you can overcome that risk by having more numbers, right? Diversify your assets. So I think that it's important that we reframe how we pitch or discuss egg freezing to patients, because it's not an insurance policy, but it is an opportunity to have a child in the future in a door that otherwise might be closing.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to add something onto that as well, is that the reason why it's not an insurance policy is going back to the science. We understand very little about the science of the egg. And so therefore, a physician, an embryologist can't pick a high-quality egg from a low-quality egg. And so if we don't understand the science of the egg itself, then how can we develop the new innovations and technologies that can lead to a practice being able to pick an egg that is more likely to be fertilization competent and lead to a healthy embryo and a healthy pregnancy. And there's a lot of really important scientific innovation that just doesn't exist right now. But it's necessary because this technology is living out in the society. Thousands and thousands of women are being considering, and it's a 2-year process, I understand, to consider freezing your eggs or not, as it exists in the scientific literature, to ultimately decide to freeze their eggs, but then not appreciate that on the other end of this, we don't know much about the egg itself. The science of the egg is something we really don't understand.
By that token, if it's not an insurance policy, we shouldn't be thinking about it that way. Are we doing too much of it? Is there such a thing as people who are doing it too young? I just did a whole report on 23, 24, 25-year-olds doing it on TikTok. I understand by the science, the assumption, right, is the eggs are healthier then. But is this something that so many young women should just be like, you know, I graduated, I'm freezing my eggs now. Should we be doing that?
I think it is really important for women to have the option and the personal agency and the education to understand what this is and what it isn't. But I also think that the category, because fertility is now so destigmatized and we're able to talk about it openly, and there are more and more providers, which are good, being built and popping up, we do run a risk of over-commercialization of certain treatments like egg freezing and IVF, where, you know, I do worry that women in particular are being marketed to and sold treatments that they may not need, or being accelerated into treatments that they may not necessarily, may not be medically appropriate at that particular moment in time. I don't think it's for us to say whether you're 24 and 25, you should or should not freeze your eggs. I think it's important that we build a healthcare system and an infrastructure that educates the woman about what it is, what the benefits and what the costs are, and allows her to express her full decision-making agency to pick what's best for herself. And I don't think all of those pieces, I think we're hearing, from others, like, I don't think all of those pieces necessarily exist today.
I don't think that it is, I agree with you. I don't think that that should be our decision. The opportunity exists. The live birth rate per one single egg, if you're 30, is 5 to 8%.
Right.
So that means that if we're trying to get you good odds to get to one baby, I need 20. Okay, that's usually 1 month. So what if you want to have more than one child? What if you want to have more of an opportunity? What if you're really chasing your dreams and you're going to have your own research lab and you want to start your family way later? You might need more. And that is one of the things, is that should we encourage younger women to do it? On my end of the table, the 24-year-old who runs out of eggs, the 32-year-old who was told she had more time but now is in diminished ovarian reserve and doesn't have time, would say, absolutely, I wish I had been even told that this was an opportunity. We should talk about it more. We don't know what our reproductive timeline will be. I can check your ovarian reserve today or your egg count. It can be great. It cannot be great in a couple years from now. Everybody's on their own pathway with how many eggs they're born with. Everybody's going to run out of them, and you're losing them every single month no matter what. And I don't know how many you were born with, so maybe you're losing them very, very quickly. So Tammy's right that it's not my judgment, but one of the things that we don't talk about is that that success rate goes up with the younger you are and the more eggs you have. One of the biggest issues is that when you have the opportunity to have the biggest ROI, you're too young to afford it very often.
Right.
So when we see that parents are gifting it to their college-age daughters for graduation, I mean, that's a huge gift to feel like you can pursue your dreams without worrying about it. You know, as a physician who did my training before the age of egg freezing, that's something I worried about. Like, will I be too old when I'm through with this pathway to have the family I want? And when I had my own infertility, start worrying, oh, I caused this myself. So I don't think that egg freezing is something that is going to be over commercialized. If anything, it is something that we don't have access to the right population enough. And I'll see older women coming in at 40 trying to freeze their eggs, and the success rates are just so much lower. They really miss the window of greatest opportunity.
I agree. I think parents should not have to pay for this. You shouldn't have to take out a loan. Everybody's employer should pay for this, so you should all go ask your employers for carrot and fertility benefits. I was diagnosed with premature ovarian aging. I've done 3 rounds of egg freezing. To Natalie's point, I didn't know I had diminished ovarian reserve until I was in the clinic and being told, 3 weeks before my egg freezing cycle. I wish I had known 10 years earlier. And so we need to build a better, healthcare system that empowers women to do exactly what's right for them when it's right.
I totally agree. We're doing, as I mentioned, a bunch of reporting on this, and soon on the Today Show I'm going to be talking about my own situation, which was that I had no idea that I have PCOS, and it's fairly severe and probably going to be tough. And so I decided to go forward with that retrieval, but you don't know until you know that you have the coverage to present yourself to a doctor's office to even get any of the testing done to understand that. Dr. Clark, I think everybody's probably fairly familiar with IVF and vitro fertilization, kind of how it works, knows somebody who's been through it. What about IVG?
So IVG stands for in vitro gametogenesis. So the G, the gamete, is the egg and the sperm cell. And so this is a technology that is not available in your neighborhood IVF clinic. This is a conceptual technology that has being demonstrated in scientific labs. So what in vitro gametogenesis means is making a gamete outside of the body. So what does that mean for the person who's generating the gamete? So if we're talking about a person with ovaries, it would mean not needing to go through hormonal stimulation in order to get the gamete, because the gamete would be generated in the laboratory, and that gamete would then be used for in vitro fertilization. It also picks up where IVF leaves off. So IVF, you need a gamete. But what about those individuals that that don't have gametes. For example, somebody who has gone through cancer treatment at a young age, and that cancer treatment has led to infertility. Or we talked about in the previous health session this new and emerging innovative technology of treatment for sickle cell disease through gene editing, which is going to hopefully transform the care of those individuals who have sickle cell disease. But the potential side effect of that therapy is infertility and loss of gametes. So what in vitro gametogenesis has the potential to provide is the creation of gametes for those individuals who no longer are able to do so and have gone through unsuccessful IVF with their own gametes.
When will this be something that's at your neighborhood clinic?
Yeah, so for science to become medicine, there is a long regulatory road, and in vitro gametogenesis will go through a long regulatory road in order for it to move into the clinic. And so right now, where the science sits is it's possible to make a gamete in the lab from a model. So scientists, when they do experiments, they use models, and these models are often small animals that are used as a way of mammals, of a way of testing, will this technology work in this mammal before it gets translated into, for example, the human population. So in vitro gametogenesis is possible using small animal models in the lab. And so right now, where the technology is going is translating it from using animal cells to using human cells. And right now, no lab or company has been able to successfully create human gametes in the lab from stem cells. But I do believe that this is on the horizon.
Wow. Tammy, we've been touching on this, but obviously none of this is cheap. In fact, it's very expensive, which means that it is only available to people who can either afford it or have coverage. What are you seeing in terms of trends with companies starting to cover this? And what does this look like for people who can't afford it? Like, how bad is this barrier to access?
Well, it's a very significant barrier to access. Historically, the profile is white, wealthy people show up at the fertility clinic to seek care, even though we know that infertility presents in higher rates in other populations like Black populations, potentially even Asian American populations, depending on latest research. So we know that there is a significant barrier from a cost perspective. Also, medical debt is the number one reason that Americans file for bankruptcy in this country. And so taking out loans to pay for very expensive fertility treatments is not something that I think we want to, encourage the country and the world to do at scale. Healthcare in this country, you can agree or disagree, is really delivered through jobs. More than 160 million people get their healthcare benefits through their employer. And so we're very focused on working with payers, employers, large health plans to make it easy for them to distribute and increase the number of people who have access to fertility benefits like Carrot that help you pay for care using your employer-sponsored dollars, that help you get to a high-quality provider in a managed network, and also does the education, the hand-holding in a really medically appropriate and dispassionate way to help you understand younger eggs are better. What are the risks of waiting? What are the benefits of waiting? And really giving you a care team that can help you with your physical health as well as your mental and emotional health. But it's early days. I think we've come a long way in the last 5 years in seeing many more employers participate, and it's obviously a big part of how we're growing so quickly. But most employers in this country actually do not offer any type of coverage. So, while we're really excited about the progress as well as the promise of the opportunity ahead, there's a lot more work to do.
What Tammy's not saying is that she has a non-discriminatory program that allows a patient to come into my clinic and I can say, this is the treatment that's best for you. And it doesn't matter who they are, how long they've tried, how old they are, what their medical diagnosis is. They have the benefit to do the treatment. Standard insurance does not work that way. So even if you have a standard insurance program that covers fertility, you often have to meet certain criteria. You have to try to get pregnant for 12 months. You have to be a certain age. You have to have a certain diagnosis. If you're a same-sex couple and you don't have any sperm in your relationship, you still have to try to get pregnant for 12 months before they'll kick in. So you have to buy 12 months worth of donor sperm, pay for 12 IUIs out of pocket before your medical insurance will cover a dime. So the traditional insurance-based system is a very reactive approach for somebody's last-ditch effort at trying to have a family versus a more modern approach saying fertility care, having a family should be a human right, and to try to level the playing field, that it isn't the insurance company's job to know what treatment's best for somebody at a certain age.
Well, that's part of the reproductive justice movement. And the tenets of the reproductive justice movement are around that the choice to have or not have a family is a basic human right, and governments are required to help an individual to realize that basic human right, which is the choice to have a family if it requires assisted reproduction, then to go that way, or the choice to not have a family, and so therefore contraception as well. I would like to say, though, that there's a lot of Americans in this country who don't have employer-based insurance, and those Americans tend to be the poor and underserved, and so they don't have access. They're really shut out of being able to have the family that they choose, which should be a basic human right.
Well, this is a great segue into the conversation about what we're seeing happen across the country right now when it comes to policy being enacted, but also just attitudes in some ways being expressed, maybe shifting. Two big pieces of news that I'm sure most of you are aware of course, what happened in Alabama, a ruling out of their Supreme Court, as well as what we just saw happen with Southern Baptists about a week or so ago, 60% of that congregation choosing to vote against IVF being something that the members of their congregation should be using. What does that mean in the context of what we're talking about here? Especially, let's just take that number. A congregation, by the way, Southern Baptist, sort of this bellwether when it comes to attitudes of a lot of people in this country. 60% saying, I'm not comfortable with this, that I think maybe that this goes against what I believe. By the same token, 40% in that same room, many of whom stood up and said, this is how I had my family, this is how my best friend had their family. Are we going to start seeing more of this? I mean, I think for a little while, we've kind of accepted this as wow, this is this amazing technology that might mean that now I can have a family and I thought I couldn't. And then some people see this as, is this a step backwards? Or is this people kind of wrapping their arms around it and making known how they feel about it?
We should be highly concerned by the idea that political leaders who do not understand science are making health decisions that can impact your ability to have a family. If you walked into my office, Savannah, and you feel that for your religion, you don't want to have excess embryos, or you don't want to have embryos frozen, anything that is fertilized needs to be transferred. There's already ways to modify IVF for individual beliefs. It might be less successful, it might take longer, it might cost more money, but it can be done. But to dictate that everybody has to go through in that way, we've seen that in other countries. We've seen a lack of success with that, higher risks, higher rate of multiples. We've seen less people able to have the family they want to have. When we see the common narrative, what's underlying all of these different political decisions is, does life begin at fertilization? This is why those of us who are in the reproductive industry are very quick to say, IVF, birth control, pregnancy management, and abortion care are closely linked. If you start to define when life is happening, you're going to lose access to so many different rights. It's wild, in my opinion, to say that life begins at fertilization when I know of those eggs that are fertilized, so few of them are even going to make it into an embryo. And then one single embryo still doesn't have the highest majority chance of becoming a baby. So it takes more than just cells coming together in a lab, right? We know that a uterus has to gestate the pregnancy. So there's a lot more at lie that is involved in human reproduction. But we should be really concerned because that side of the political agenda has been really loud for a while. They have been very captivating, and the side of science really hasn't spoken out to the way they need to say this is what IVF is, this is what IVF isn't, this is what you're allowed to make the choice to do. What you do with your embryo should be your decision. That should be a decision that you have the right to make. It will hugely impact the ability for people with cancer to freeze eggs or embryos for the future. People who have genetic diseases that could be eliminated from their family line. We see terrible diseases. We see things like Huntington's. We see cancer mutations like BRCA. I see patients come in saying, I could not pass this burden on to my children. That feels life-changing to some people who grew up watching a parent die, saying, I'm never going to have kids because I don't want to pass this on. So the technology has advanced to the place where it can help so many people. And if we let a common political narrative wrap through it, it's really doing an injustice. So we all should be afraid. We all should speak out about why access to reproductive care as a whole is really important for not just women, but for society.
I'd like to pick up on the when does life begin, because I think that that's extremely important. And so as a biologist, I would say life does begin at fertilization. But I think this is where some terminology has got conflated, and that is, when does personhood begin? And personhood is a social construct. Personhood is something that society ascribes to an entity. In this particular case, it's the embryo. And so embryo life and personhood, while they're being conflated as the exact same thing, makes this argument extremely complex, because outside of being a human being, of course, life begins at fertilization because that's the beginning of a new life. But is it a person? And person is very difficult to define. What is a person? It's a very value-laden topic, just as reproductive science and health itself, a very value-laden topic. So people bring their values into the decision-making process. And so when does an embryo become a person? This is what's driving a lot of this narrative right now. And the idea that being a person is the same thing as a biological entity, they're two very different things. And as scientists and educators, we haven't done a very good job of trying to educate people what's the difference between personhood, what goes into decision-making around personhood, who decides what is personhood versus the biology of what is an embryo. And I think we need to do more work there. But it goes back to reproductive science is essentially missing from higher education. And so there is no opportunities for students in higher education to learn about reproductive science, these topics such as personhood. In high school, what's taught is sex education and not reproductive biology. So the number of students that come into my classroom and say, thank you, Professor Clark. I wish someone had have told me that I am going to run the risk of having challenges with having a baby at age 35. No one told me that. And so I think there's just not enough education in this country that's coming from places that are trustworthy and not don't have conflict of interest.
To make the to make the personhood muddier is that the political agenda is calling them personhood bills, saying that life begins at fertilization and trying to establish that an embryo is a person. And that's what happened in the Alabama case. And why that impacted so many people is that puts a clinic, its employees, even patients at so much liability if something happens in that process. But so this idea of what Dr. Clark explains really eloquently about personhood and life, all of these personhood bills, which we've been fighting for over a decade against, they're saying that, well, personhood is the same thing. The moment that life begins is personhood. And so that's what's so confusing, because we see that these terms, conception, fertilization, implantation, personhood, are being assigned meaning that they don't all have. But in political bills, they are getting that meaning. Even in Texas, in our very famous abortion ban, there's what we call an IVF carve-out, saying that nothing in this, even though life begins at fertilization, nothing in this should prohibit IVF from happening, people from using IVF technology in its standard way. Goes all this language really nice. And then the very last line says, except if a dispute is to arise over the disposition of an embryo, a judge shall side with whatever's in the best interest of the embryo. So regardless of what you put on your consent form, if you take it to the court, the judge has the authority, the power to decide what is that embryo's best interest.
And a lot of these personhood bills are not necessarily driven by somebody who doesn't have a science education. And so, because there are physicians who are champions of these bills, but again, going back to by muddying the waters between biology and science and this social construct that's personhood, the legitimacy of this argument it gains traction because you have clinicians who are bringing those arguments forward. And I think that also is complicating it even further.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I think the last couple of years and the changes that have happened in the reproductive healthcare world have created an inflection point, and we are at the cusp of a new catalyst that will begin what I think will be a decades-long conversation about these topics. I think there is a bright spot that I have seen over the last at least 6 months, which is in the wake of Alabama. What we have seen is actually broad consensus around IVF and access to IVF among our customers. And even if you look at some of the more recent polling, there is 70% of all Americans across sex, men and women, across political affiliation, across gender, even across religious affiliation to varying degrees, the overwhelming majority of people, when they are just people, support access to IVF and they think it's a good thing. And so we're going to see scientific trends. We're going to see, cultural trends. We are also going to continue secular trends. And the secular trends, in my personal point of view, are more permanent and more powerful. People want access to care. This is healthcare. And I think while this will be a potentially messy and long conversation, it's a national debate and international conversation that we are now embarking on. We have to, I think, be on the side of secular trends and access to care.
I guess, though, I have a feeling here in Aspen, at the Aspen Ideas Health Festival, there might be a lot of similar thought when it comes to the way that this should look or what access should look like. But as we see these attitudes shift and maybe become louder, Dr. Clark, to your point about two things, the fact that personhood is murkier, and second, that clinicians are behind some of this, do you think this ends up looking much like abortion does right now, where it becomes a patchwork across the country?
Yes, I think so. And going back to your point about even with abortion care, the majority of Americans agree that women should have access to abortion care. Yet we have a Supreme Court ruling which took away that right to abortion care for so many women. And then that leads it down to the states. And so then you end up with these patchwork of regulations around what is allowable and what is not allowable. And even in the education system, what can be talked about or what cannot be talked about. There's a real challenge right now as a university professor. What can I talk about with my students? Am I able to talk about transgender care in my reproductive science classroom? In California, I can, but in other states, they cannot. Am I able to talk about IVF? Am I able to talk about excess embryos? Am I able to talk about how do you dispose of an embryo, which is a byproduct of IVF? I think all of these there's a lot of attacks and challenges at the level of the states on what an educator like me can and cannot talk about with my students. And this is knowledge they need to know moving forward as part of their reproductive health and wellness.
I think it's important to say that IVF has not changed in any state since Roe was overturned. I think we saw it challenged in Alabama. It's still up and functioning. In Texas, 0 things have changed. Now, did we build a new IVF lab this year, and did we make certain allowances when it comes to technology and our processes to try to protect patients the best? We've had, already in southern states, there have been issues with embryo disposition, where a state will have to ship embryos to a neighboring state. So that's not a new thing where access to care differs based on the state that you live in. And I don't think that anybody who is trying to get pregnant, who wants to preserve their fertility, should be fearful to pursue assisted reproductive technology in the current environment. We don't know what the future will look like. And as we had a pre-panel discussion saying that embryos that are already created are going to be vastly more protected than the ability to create them in the future. So if you're on the fence, if you're part of that 2-year journey of, I think maybe I should do this, but I haven't done it yet, no time like the present. In Texas, we're actually seeing more people turn to IVF than ever with our abortion ban in place. We're seeing more people lean towards IVF with genetic screening so that they can have a higher chance of having a baby that has less abnormalities and not being put in the difficult position of carrying a child with potentially a terminal illness or having to travel to another state to try to receive care. So we're actually seeing the opposite, which is more people are turning towards reproductive technology right now, viewing it as a safer opportunity. And I do promise you that all of us who work in the reproductive space are highly invested in trying to make sure that IVF can still exist, that you still can have access to egg freezing, to freezing embryos, to using your embryos how you want to. And might that have to look different in some states in the future? Yes, but I still think that we're at a place where abortion care has been hard for a long time in Texas. You already could only go to 2 places to get, a surgical abortion after 12 weeks. So it was already extremely limited. So we have a narrative that makes it obviously tougher, but the idea that there's still been a way to practice medicine, it shouldn't scare somebody away from doing it. And I have seen some patients say, I'm too scared to even go through this or to have embryos. And to me, that's the saddest part of it. Because if you don't take that moment and freeze your eggs before you start chemotherapy for your breast cancer, you might not have another moment.
I could ask you guys questions all day, but I'm going to share the time. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I see one right over here.
Hi there. I am lucky enough to have a beautiful 6-year-old, thanks to IVF, and male infertility. So thank you for talking about that. I really appreciate it. I'm also a survey researcher. Gallup recently released data that found that 82% of Americans consider IVF morally acceptable. Only 49% say the destruction of embryos created through IVF is morally acceptable. That's all Americans, not just religious Americans. Is there a terminology problem? How do you talk about this to sort of bridge that gap that embryos don't magically turn into babies?
I think that's a great question because even a genetically tested, chromosomally normal embryo has at best a 65% chance of turning into a living child. So there's a huge percentage of those embryos that are not going to turn into children, even in the perfect circumstance. I do think that, discarding, trashing, disposing gives this connotation like you don't care or that something is happening that is bad versus the idea that how I frame it to my patients is, that's a potential life, right? There's a lot of steps that have to happen for that embryo to become a child. For patients who come in and who are highly concerned, I think it's important to have the discussion that, we can do things differently. And I have some patients who we've fertilized half their eggs and frozen half as eggs so that they didn't have as many embryos, with the idea that at some point of their life, any normal embryo, they would give a chance and they would transfer it. And I have one patient on their 4th pregnancy because that was their approach. The problem with systematically limiting how many eggs you fertilize is that it's going to result in such lowering of success rates, where research has poured into the technology to try to make this more successful. Because if we already have limited access, if we make it less successful, it's going to be just so much harder and so many fewer people will be able to experience parenthood. But I do think we have to do a good job of explaining that you have an individual choice. So when we go through IVF, we make decisions, and understanding what that choice is opens the door for a lot. Every single day I'll see a patient who says, I don't believe in IVF. And sometimes these people need IVF. It's their only choice. Maybe fallopian tubes are blocked, or sperm counts are so low, or they have a genetic disease, and this is the opportunity that they have. And I'll always say, well, why? Maybe we can overcome that. Maybe we can do something in your cycle that makes you feel like IVF isn't socially unjust. And a lot of times when you just educate what IVF is, what it isn't, normal loss from egg to embryo to baby, people feel really differently about the process when they learn more about it.
I'm also, I think it's really interesting where we are now speaking about generational shifts. who I'm seeing on a university campus, the millennials and the Gen Zs, I'm a Gen Xer, are many young people who are here because of in vitro fertilization. And they're very curious about this technology. So when I'm speaking to a class of students, maybe 100 students or so, there's undoubtedly a number of students in that class who are IVF babies, who are now in their 20s. And so they'll come up to me afterwards and say, no one's actually talked to me about IVF or the process or the biology behind it. And there's a real hunger and eagerness to learn. So who we have now moving into our society that are really empowered in their 20s are the young people who are here because of in vitro fertilization, and I'm really excited about the questions they have and the way they think about what is family and what it means to have a family. And it's not the traditional way that was the case in when I was born as a Gen Xer in the 70s. It's a very new way of having a family, and in vitro fertilization, assisted reproductive technologies have made that possible, and they find that so exciting.
That is really neat to hear. I saw one right here.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rachel Meyer-Ediger. I work at MITRE, and I'm very curious with the latest reproductive restrictions that are happening across the country and fewer medical students wanting to go into obstetrics as their specialty, and also the ones that do go into the specialty are not getting the training that they need to respond to obstetric emergencies that are happening, with also the generational shift of way more women using fertility treatments. I feel like we're creating an uneven divide of we need more providers for types of fertility or obstetric services, but we're not creating the workforce. So my question is, what can be done to strengthen the workforce to tackle probably generational issues that are gonna come from this?
I'll say I did my OBGYN residency at Parkland Hospital in the late 2000s, so a long time ago. I was there for 4 years before I did my fertility fellowship. We could not do a single abortion. Things in Texas have not changed. What we are seeing is that OBGYN is still a really competitive specialty. It's actually hard for students who want to match to get into it. But we're seeing a huge shift in the programs people are applying to. What we're gonna have happen and what we're seeing happen is we're gonna have care deserts, where in southern states where you have abortion restriction, you're going to have certain people less likely to want to practice in those areas unless they have a deep tie to the region and a desire to care for those people. That's been an issue in certain regions across the country, though, for a long time, right? And in cities where we live, there's no shortage of physicians. But in certain areas that need it the most, we have a huge problem where trained physicians in that specialty do not exist and do not practice. So it's becoming highlighted in the obstetric care because so many people have to access that. But we've seen it happen across the board when it comes to access to a cardiologist. If you're in small town Texas, how are you going to go see somebody? So I think a lot of that is that medical training is extremely expensive. We should be helping incentivize people to want to go back to their hometown and making medical training not such a burden. When you pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to go to medical school, you then get paid less than minimum wage to work in residency, you come out with such a debt deficit that you can't afford the salary that small town Texas is going to give you as it is. So I do think systematically, we need to say, how do we help get more physicians into areas that are needed? You know, pregnancy complications exist, and honestly, probably the residents in Texas are seeing pregnancy complications that they haven't in a while because of the lack of abortion access. So I think the biggest thing is, you know, really not having people trained in how to provide abortion care when it is needed. And to the point of the conversation, we are concerned that could we face a future where, let's say, Alabama goes back and they say, yep, embryos are people, you can't do IVF, and every clinic shuts down, all the doctors will leave, right? It costs $4 million to build an IVF lab, $4 million. I can't keep it open if I have no patients, if I can't do IVF. So I would be forced out of Texas to go somewhere else. So I think that we have to really start the discussion by all talking about why reproductive health in general, which impacts not just half the population, but all the population.
But it's not only OBGYNs who are part of a care team either, to get to your point. And so in addition to there being more resources to enable more OBGYNs to enter into these specialty programs and ultimately to specialize in REI, there could be a rethinking of the workforce itself. And so what about the role of the nurse practitioner? We are learning about maternal health outcomes, for example, and the important role that doulas play. This is not even a medically trained person, but it's an advocate that's in the room for somebody. So I think thinking about health care, reproductive care as being highly medicalized is a challenge in the reproductive medicine community because it's so technical and it's so scientific. But I do think rethinking the workforce and care team around people who are accessing reproductive care is really, really important.
We are almost out of time, but I see a hand right here.
You can hold. Okay. Hi. Thank you guys so much for this. I wrote it down because I get nervous. I feel an urgency to decide what to do with my surplus embryos. I have a 6-month-old baby, thanks to IVF, but it's costing me thousands in storage fees, and I'm worried I might not get to make that choice myself if I wait indefinitely. I want to donate them to science and research, but because of liability and legislation, I can't find anywhere that will accept them. Stanford recently stopped. So do you have any insight or resources that you could share with people weighing disposition options in this climate?
I feel strongly about embryo disposition. You know, one thing I'll say is that my hardest cases I ever see is somebody who discarded their embryos and something tragic happened and they wanted to have a child again. I always recommend that patients consider sending them to a cheaper off-site storage place. Would recommend that being in a state of the color blue and paying less money if you don't think you're going to use them. Give yourself a couple years and make sure you feel that same way. You can't really, embryo research is very difficult in the United States for a lot of logistical and political reasons. A lot of times if you end up donating your embryos to research, it goes to your own lab and it goes to training junior embryologists. Now that's extremely important because your embryologist determines the entire ability of your lab success rates. And they have to train embryo biopsy and freezing and thawing and these micromanipulation techniques. So a lot of times we think about what research might be in our brain, but then we reframe it to our patients. Well, if you feel comfortable donating them to training so that the embryologists can train and learn and we get more embryologists. Lack of embryologists is a huge problem. That's actually much greater than lack of physicians when it comes to fertility care. And so that might be something that many clinics say, well, you can donate your embryos for training, so for clinical training of the lab personnel. And for a lot of my patients, that makes them feel really good because it's not just discarding them. There's a future purpose to those embryos. They're helping train more embryologists, which will help more people have families. There's always donating them too now, which I always say is the Wild West of reproductive care. And we know egg donation and sperm donation have been pretty standard, but embryo donation is the new wave. It's certainly, ethically, people are going to feel strong about it one way or another, but if you felt like you wanted to give those embryos an opportunity, it's just not you, then there are ways that you can donate them to have other people have an opportunity. But when it comes to discarding them, but like not wanting to just discard them, you want research or training, then the easiest thing is going to be to talk to your lab about training. But I tell my patients, send them off site for 5 years because life is hard. You just cannot predict the bad things that can happen. And you would hate to look back on that one decision and you might be past the age where you could generate them again.
I also want to say that just one quick thing, I want you to know you're not alone, that embryo disposition is a really complex conversation that an individual needs to go through with themselves and with their family. And so often the decision is actually no decision to just keep leaving them in storage until the cost becomes so prohibitive. So I want you to know you're not alone in going through these decisions. This is complicated. One of the things we're learning in research is that what owners of embryos want is more options with disposition. So there's some new disposition approaches that are emerging, like compassionate disposition, because an individual may not want to throw away their embryo and they want to dispose of it in a in a compassionate way. So there's new mechanisms opening up, but what you're going through is there's millions of women and their families.
There's 2 million embryos considered abandoned in storage in the
Wow.
United States.
Wow.
But
Thank
you raised
you.
a really good point, which is it's not just the fertility treatments that are expensive, it's storage that's expensive. And I think, the gaps in this area of healthcare are just so tremendous. And so people do often feel pressure, ethical pressure, moral pressure, but also financial pressure to make a decision. And keeping them for 5 years is not cheap, right? It's a non-trivial cost. And so, there are fertility benefits like Carrot that can help you pay for storage as well as care. So that's another option for you as well.
Some clinics upcharge that embryo cost per year so astronomically high. And because they think that most patients are too lazy or fearful to ship them somewhere else that is more affordable. If you're going to go through treatment in the next year, it might not make sense to move them and you pay the big high fee. But if these are embryos you don't think you're going to use unless X, Y, or Z, which is where a lot of people are in that position, then sending them to a more long-term storage facility is absolutely an option, and those prices are much, much cheaper. And I'm happy to give you the names after the case.
Thank you to my fabulous panel. Thank you for being a great audience. I appreciate y'all being here.